Well, good morning, Crossbridge. My name is Jason. I am not Chuck, and it's always good to be here with you guys a couple times every summer. So I get to be here this week, and then not next week, but then the following week I'll be back, and that's actually Father's Day, which is crazy. Then we'll be over halfway through June, and it's just flying by. But it's always a pleasure to be with you here this morning. Chuck texted me this morning and said, "Hey, I'm praying for you. Thanks for being there." And I assured him that my thanks was to him and to you guys for allowing me to come and be here. And I always like to say when I'm here, just from an outside perspective, I think it's always good just to be reminded of something that you might know is true, but sometimes kind of when we become familiar with things, we lose some of the freshness of it. And so I want you to know, as you have become familiar with Crossbridge, or maybe this is even your first week and you're wondering, is this a place I want to become familiar with? Let me assure you, from an outside perspective, looking in, that what you have here is very special and it's very unique. And we understand, and if you're in tune at all with much of the media or the world that's going on around us, that most of the publicity that the church gets these days is pretty bad. And some of it rightfully so. Some things are being called out and unearthed and dealt with, and God is doing some cleansing for sure. I want you to know that what I love about a place like Crossbridge is that there's a solidness, there's an integrity, there's a commitment to the gospel that is continually preached and communicated from this pulpit and lived out in a variety of different ways in this church. And this is just a really good, unique place. And so I want you to be assured of that. I want you to be reminded of that. If you've just kind of been here for years and you're like, this is just where we go, and we just kind of show up, that's what we do, I want you to know that you've got a really cool thing here. And if you're new here with us at Crossbridge, I want to encourage you to plug in. And maybe this summer is the summer that you look back on years from now and say, man, that summer was just transformational for us and our family. We found a place that we really felt like we could connect and grow. So that was not scripted. Chuck didn't text me this morning and say, hey, thanks for being here, praying for you. Can you say all of these things? No, not at all. That's just me wanting to encourage you, and what an honor it is to be here with you guys. So I've got a couple of goals this morning. It's actually going to be real simple. We might actually get out early actually this morning. We just got a simple thing to do, a couple of simple things. Number one, really we had one simple thing to do, and then I showed up this morning and the Holy Horse Trough was in front. So I've added a second simple goal for us this morning. The first is for me to not fall in here this morning. I mean, it is like right there, okay? And then the second is this. We've just got one big idea that we're going to look at this morning. One big idea, one principle I think that we can all relate with. It's going to come straight from where we are in this series that we're continuing in the book of John. And so it's coming right out of where we've already been. We're continuing in that flow, and we enter into the story that many of us are quite familiar with. And so it's one of those stories that if you're in the church or outside the church, it's kind of become a kind of social folklore. It's just a very familiar story, whether you're in the church or outside of the church, but it's got a really beautiful, simple, but nuanced application to it for each of us. And so that's our goal. We're going to lean into that. We're going to ask some questions of ourselves, and then we're probably going to get out a little early this morning. So I want you to think about stories, and I want you to think about your favorite story. Maybe it's a movie, maybe it's a book, whatever it might be. And I want you to think about kind of the story arc of that story. And what you'll find is that there is generally speaking, a familiar story arc to most every good story. And so my wife and I saw a movie yesterday. We saw the new Top Gun. If you've seen it, it's pretty legit, right? Like, you're like, all right, finally, there's a good movie out there to actually watch. We actually left the theater and thought two things. Number one, that's the first time we've sat in a theater in a long time. And then number two, that's the first time we've actually watched an entire movie without falling asleep at some point in a long time. Because we're at that age, right? You're like, our goal, we're going to start a movie at 8 o'clock tonight, and then the kids get in the way, the kids, and this and that, and then it's 10:30, you start a movie, you're out by 10:41, right? So it was actually really good, and it followed the familiar story arc. And the story arc of most of our favorite movies, most of our favorite stories, what makes a story good is this arc, this relationship between tension and time. And so in every good story that we're familiar with, and again, think of your favorite movie, whether it's a Star Wars or your favorite book or whatever it might be. It's a romantic comedy. Every Christmas, I am instructed to subscribe to the Hallmark channel and the Lifetime channel because we just absorb Hallmark and Lifetime Christmas movies in our home. And frankly, they're all the same. Change the characters, change the setting, exact same story. Every romantic comedy is the same story. They're all the same, and they follow this arc, this relationship between tension and time. And essentially what happens is, as time goes on, we get this character introduction in the beginning, and it's a little slow. It's a little slow, and then this tension begins to peak. And then there's this peak of tension in the story, and then there's some kind of happy resolution. And it's that peak of tension, frankly, that makes stories good. A lot of us think that we don't really want tension in our own stories. Like, we want kind of our story arc in life to look like this. But really, if you think about it, no, we don't. This is a boring life to live. It's a boring story to tell. It's a boring movie to watch. And so let's say I came to you and said, hey, I just saw this incredible movie. And you're like, great, what's it about? And I'll just make something up that's super boring. I'd say it's about these California guys, and they sell seashells on the seashore, but they're the kind of guys that are on the House Hunters show, and they sell seashells by the seashore, but they've got like a budget of $11.4 million for a house in California. So they live this lifestyle, and all they do all day long is sell seashells, and they play sand volleyball. And then one day they're like, hey guys, let's invite some more people to play. And so they get more people to play volleyball. And then midway through the day, they get tired. They take a break. They go and eat some tacos at the taco truck by the beach. And they're really great. And then they come back out and they decide we're going to do some surfing. And then at the end of the day, the sun's setting. It's Southern California, beautiful. And they're sitting on the porch of their $11.4 million home, just enjoying the view. And then the movie ends. And you're like, well, that's actually not a very good story. As a matter of fact, it makes me not like those guys. I'm like, yeah, me too, right? I'm a little jealous, I'm a little angry, okay? But that's kind of a boring story. And I said, great, what if, though, we changed the story just slightly and we said, there's a bunch of guys playing volleyball on the beach in Southern California, and then all of a sudden an earthquake erupts, and the world splits open, the earth splits open, and these guys fall in, and the rest of the story is about this rescue mission of how many guys can we save, and how are we going to get down there, how are we going to do it? You're like, all right, actually, I actually started to hate these guys, and I love the fact that they've now fallen into a pit, and I'm curious, how's this story going to play out? I'm curious now, how is the story going to play out? How are they going to save these guys? When we introduce tension into stories, it actually makes the stories good. Now, here's the irony of tension, is that we really, really, really love tension in other people's stories. We really, really, really don't like tension in our stories. And I think we kind of think that we want our story arc to look something like this. But I think most of us would say, I really don't. And I'm actually caught in this tension between my desire to not have tension, but my understanding that tension is what makes stories good. And when we reach that peak of tension, the question then ensues, how is this going to play out? Do they have what it takes to overcome? What's the resolution to this? You want me to spoiler alert Top Gun? I will. I'm not going to. I won't. But there's a peak of tension. There's a peak of tension in it, and there's a question that looms, and then there's a resolution. And I don't know what your spouse or friend or girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever is like, but mine is one that tends to talk and ask questions during the entire movie. And so she's constantly asking, what do you think? What's about to happen? What do you think? What's about to happen? And then somehow, within the first 5 minutes, she's able to call out, like, who's the murderer? Who's the culprit? Who's the person? And then she's always right at the end, right? So she's like working through this tension from the very beginning, okay? That's what makes stories good, okay? Maybe we don't even want flatline stories. Maybe we're like, actually, as time goes on, I'd really appreciate it, God, if things just got easier for me, right? Like when our kids get a certain age, then maybe things will get easier. And let me break it to you. When your kids get a certain age, some things get significantly easier. No more diapers, no more car seats, no more that, right? And then some new things get significantly more complicated. Okay? Maybe as life goes on, then things will get easier. And in reality, this is what the story arc of most of our lives look like, right? We're like, sometimes we don't know what up and down is, what's left or right, what's sideways. We don't know what's going on. We're just along for the ride, and we're trusting in the sovereignty of God to like bring it all to a resolution in the end. This is a good story to live. This is a good story to live. And so let me say this. If you at times feel like this is the story arc in which you're living, let me encourage you that this is a really, really, really good story. Because it's full of tension, and it's full of opportunities to see the faithfulness of God play out to be true. It's full of really beautiful moments. You can do a dumpster dive online and you can find all kinds of videos that kind of have this peak of tension, and it kind of draws you in and leaves you with this question of what's going to happen. Are they going to overcome? And I'll just share one of the many. I may or may not have spent way too much time dumpster diving online finding these videos, but I particularly love this one. Mama bear and cubs are following, and now you're like, what are they going to do? Are they going to make it? Can they get up? Are they going to be separated forever? One makes it. And you can kind of feel the tension building up. Like, how's this going to play out? Do they have what it takes? Is he going to figure it out? Is he now lost forever? Yeah, like the tension is so good. It's thick. And then he's like, wait a second. I love it, right? Wait a second. What am I doing, right? So here's the idea. At the peak of tension in every good story lies this question, or some form of this question. Do they have what it takes? Do I have what it takes? Think about your favorite story, your favorite movie, your favorite book, your favorite online video clip. Do they have what it takes? Do I have what it takes to fill in the blank, to overcome? In the romantic comedies, do they have what it takes to figure out now how, she got an advertising job in Chicago and went back home at Christmas to some tiny little village with a quaint general store next to a lake, and it's always snowing and it's perfect and it's beautiful, but it never feels uncomfortable. It's always a comfortable snow and a comfortable temperature, and she meets the man of her dreams who stayed there and never left there, and now she's kind of caught in this tension of, do I leave my great job in Chicago to come move back to the country and work at the general store to marry the man of my dreams? Or does he leave the country and come and become a city boy? And do we have what it takes to overcome? That's literally every romantic comedy movie, right? Do we have what it takes to overcome this particular set of tensions? Let me just share with you a little bit about how this has played out in our own lives. And one of the most significant ways that we've had to kind of confront this tension and figure out how are we going to navigate this and how are we going to overcome this. 10 years ago, my wife and I became foster parents in Houston. And if you've been around at all, I've shared a little bit of our story over the last several times of being here, but this is really the peak of tension in our story, and we celebrate 20 years of marriage in 3 weeks. And so literally half of our marriage has been lived within this. Yeah, it's crazy, 20 years. How am I even, I'm only 27 years old. How can I be married 20 years? Oh wait, no, I'm not, right? Half of our marriage has been lived within kind of the outcomes and the back end part of this navigating of this peak of tension. And so here's how it played out for us as we were confronted with this, and my wife had far more clarity than I did at the very beginning. And so my concerns going into this were our daughters at the time were 5, 3, and 1 when we started our foster care training process. And so I was kind of using them as an excuse, as a reason, as a scapegoat for why it wasn't the right time. They're just not the right age, whatever that might mean. When are our kids ever the right age to do something that's hard or scary? I don't know. So I was just kind of using that as an excuse. We had just planted a church, which is how I came to know Chuck and how I became to know Crossbridge and be a part of this community, as we had just planted a church on the north side of Houston. And so my question was, if we do this, do I have what it takes to actually be the pastor and the leader to this new, young, growing, busy church that we've just planted? Do I have what it takes to be the kind of dad I need to be to my girls? Do I have what it takes to be the kind of pastor I need to be to our church and the kind of leader I need to be? Do I have what it takes to sacrifice like that? There's these funny memes online or GIFs or GIFs, whatever camp you fall in, that sometimes I see. And there's one in particular of a girl that's leaning out the window and she's just throwing money out the window. And the headline says, what it feels like raising daughters, right? Just throwing money out, just left and right, right? And we had 3 at the time, and I'm like, can we add to that? Can we add to another girl standing at the window, just throwing money out? I don't know if I can sacrifice like that. And then, of course, time and margin and capacity is always the question for us. Do I have the space in my life and the time and the capacity and the margin to actually add a whole new dynamic layer onto an already complicated system of life? And so I found these were the things that for several months I was using as the very reasons as to why it wasn't the right time for us to do this. And this was really the peak of tension for me. This was the peak of tension in the story for me. And one night, my wife comes and she says, hey, I need you to understand something. And everything was always very cordial and always very polite, and we were never at odds or at disagreement. It was never that we weren't on the same, it was never that we weren't in agreement on this. And you might often hear it say that, especially in a marriage context, that you need to make sure you're on the same page. And I get the sentiment. Especially in things like foster care, you don't want to be in disagreement about, is this something that our family needs to do? But I learned during that season that sometimes the pressure to always be on the same page before you ever do anything is so immense that it can be paralyzing. And this idea that we can never move forward in anything until we're on the exact same page might actually lend itself to you never actually doing anything. And so there's this element of trust, and hey, I'm not entirely sure, but I trust you and I'm willing to follow you. And here's what I learned during that season is that sometimes we may not be on the same page, but are we at least reading the same book? And for my wife and I, we were. This is something that we knew would be a part of our family at some point. We valued this. We believed in this. We knew that this is what God had for us. It wasn't a matter of whether or not we're reading the same book. It was just really a matter of timing for the both of us. And so we weren't on the same page, but we were reading the same book. She's just on page 200, and I'm still like thumbing through the table of contents going, I don't know, the age of our kids, our church, money, time, right? And she's going, no. You need to understand something. And she came to me late one night and she said, there's kids out there in our city that need us now. And there's families out there right now that are struggling. And there's never going to be a perfect time for us to do this. It's just time for us to do this. And she turns around and she walks upstairs. And about 15 minutes later, I follow her upstairs because I have found that one of the best ways to lead is actually know when it's time to follow. And I grew up in an environment, much like many of you, that I was always told, you're the leader of your home, you're the spiritual leader of your home, and you're like, yeah, I'm the spiritual leader of my home. And then you're like, I have no idea what that means or what to do, right? And I used to think that meant when I got married, we're going to wake up at like 4 a.m. and we're going to spend the first hour of our day in prayer and devotion, and we're not going to have a TV in our room because it's a sanctuary, and we're going to keep all that bad stuff out. And I have found after 20 years of marriage that if I woke my wife up at 4 a.m. in the morning to do a devotion, she'd be like, what are you doing, you idiot? Go back to sleep, right? And if I pulled the TV out of our room, she'd be like, no, the TV stays, you go, right? This is a sanctuary for me to watch TV, right? And so I've met with college guys where I live in College Station, and they're engaged, and they're like, hey, Jason, tell me, I'm about to get married. How do I spiritually lead my wife? And I'm like, man, like here's like 2 or 3 things that are true for everyone, but everything else I don't know because I don't know your wife. Your wife might want to get up at 4 a.m. Good luck, buddy. Mine doesn't. They're all different. Everybody's different. And so you got to learn and listen, and you got to find how do we lead. And I found that sometimes one of the best ways to lead is to be willing to follow. And over my life and the different environments that I've worked, and probably you as well, you have found that the leaders you've respected the most don't always have to be the loudest voice in the room. And the leaders that you've loved to be led by sometimes end up being leaders that know when it's time for them to be quiet and just follow. Just follow the people that God's put around them. And so this was the peak of tension for me. And it was that night that I realized I was using these things as a scapegoat and as an excuse. I was projecting my fear onto these things when really the real fear was me. The real fear was me. And here's what happens sometimes when we're confronted at this peak of tension with our own fear. This fear of not having what it takes is that we're very quick to project our fear onto external things and to blame them. It's my daughter's fault somehow that we can't foster. It's very odd to say it that way, but that's essentially what I was doing. It's my church's fault that we can't foster. It's money's fault. It's time's fault. And then I began to realize it's not their fault at all. The real fear is me. It's not so much these external things as much as it's these internal issues that I've got to do some work on. And so how it played out for me is I found that oftentimes when we are confronted with this peak of tension, whatever it might be in our own stories, we have these fruits of fear that we express. And there are our best attempts at putting words to how we feel and what we're thinking, and they come out as fruits of fear, but underneath that, there are oftentimes these root fears where we've really got to do the work. And so here's how it played out in our particular circumstance. One of the biggest fears that people express when it comes to getting involved in foster care is this fear of getting too attached. I don't know if I could get attached to a kid like that and then have to let them go. And there's all kinds of answers and responses to that. But for the sake of time, what I found was that my fear wasn't so much about getting too attached. It was really, I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to grieve like that. And you see how the fruit of fear projects itself externally. I'm afraid of attachment, and I'm afraid of these kids. And what I've found over the last 10 years of being involved in this space is that people who say I'm afraid of getting too attached are not afraid of attachment. They actually love attachment. And that's what they're afraid of. They're not afraid of kids. They love kids. And so it's not this external thing, it's more of an internal issue. It's not these things out here, it's really my fear is I don't know if I have what it takes to grieve through really hard things. And that's where we have to do the work. That's the root fear. I'm afraid of what it might cost. Again, good questions to ask. What's it going to cost me? Let's not go into this with rose-colored lenses. Let's take an honest assessment of what it is that we're getting involved in. But let's not project our fear on external things. Let's do the real work at the root of the fear where it lies, which is I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to sacrifice like that. See, it's not so much about the cost out here. It's about my heart's disposition and willingness to sacrifice and to let go. And I don't know about you, but over the last 10 years, one of the things that we've learned in our particular journey of encountering these peaks of tension and assessing the cost of moving forward is that there's this really beautiful thing that happens in the gospel when costs, what feels like cost, what is perceived as cost, eventually begin to feel and express themselves as not so much cost, but as privileges or investments. Let me illustrate. Not long ago, we had a guy come over to our house, and at the desire of my wife, who would live in a glass house if she could, just more sunlight. Like we never have enough windows. Like we could have a wall of windows, and she'd say, "I think we can squeeze another one in right there." Right? She would live on the sun if we could, and so more light. So she had a guy come over and walk through our house and kind of point out where we could put solar tubes. Okay. And so this guy shows up at our house, and he's brilliant. He knows exactly what he's doing. First, he knows that he's there because we're already sold on the idea that we want more sunlight. And so he doesn't walk in and sell us on the idea that we should want more sunlight. He's already coming in assuming that we've already bought into that idea. And then he spends the next hour not at all talking to us about how solar tubes work, how they're installed, the technical features of them, the mechanics of them, doesn't spend 1 second on any of that. What he does is he walks around our house and he begins to tell stories. And he says, gosh, if you put a solar tube here, then you could sit in this area of your home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in the middle of August in the Texas summer heat, and it will feel like you're sitting outside on your back patio, but with the comfort of your air conditioner inside. And I can just see my wife melt, just eating it up. Yes, that's what I want. And I'm going, this guy's brilliant. This is going to cost us so much money, right? Because what he's doing is he's painting a very compelling picture, and he's telling a story about not so much what it's going to cost you, but the benefits of what you're going to experience when you make that investment. And then when he hits us with the price tag, it feels less like cost and more like investment in this really beautiful thing that he's painted a picture of for us. Make sense? Yeah. And so sometimes I think we need to reframe what feels like costs for the kingdom of God into this realm in which we understand it's less about cost and it's more about investing in something that will ultimately play out as really beautiful. Because this is what we believe is true about the kingdom of God. And my fear is that maybe I don't have what it takes to sacrifice like that. How it will affect my kids if we open our home to this. Well, maybe my real fear is I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to parent through that. I can't use my kids as an excuse. Maybe my real fear is I've grown up in an environment and all I've ever read from most Christian parenting commentary is isolate and insulate your kids from anything that's hard and difficult. And now you're inviting me to actually literally open my home to things that are hard and difficult? That seems very contrary to everything I've ever learned about parenting. And I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to parent my kids through hard things. And then finally, I'm afraid that it's not going to go how I want. Well, maybe the real fear, the root fear is I'm afraid that I don't have what it takes to give up control like that. So you can see how this plays out. And so one question I have for you is, where are you right now? And perhaps God is kind of bringing you to this peak of tension in your own story. And there are certain things that you're saying and best attempts at putting words to how you're feeling. When you take an assessment of them, you find that where you're spending most of your time is kind of on these fruits of fear, when really underneath them, there's these deeper roots. And that's where we need to do the work. That's where we need to do the real work. So this is a long lead-in into a very familiar and simple story that Jesus lays out for us here in John chapter 6, because I think it beautifully speaks to that very root fear of I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to do whatever it is that you're asking me to do. That Jesus brings us to this peak of tension, and he's completely and totally okay with us being there. We're like, God, I don't know if I like being here. This feels awkward and uncomfortable. And Jesus is like, no, this is exactly where I want you. This is a really beautiful and powerful place to be, because you're going to learn something unbelievably special through this process. It's going to carry with you as you continue on in this journey. And so in John chapter 6, the story goes like this. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of Galilee. That's the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Isn't that kind of like annoying? Like, if you think about it. You know what I love about Scripture? One of the things I love about Scripture is all the things that are not in Scripture. Like all these side conversations that probably happened among people, especially the disciples, and especially in situations like this. Imagine being the disciples, and there's a huge crowd of people, and Jesus looks at you and says, hey, where are you going to get food to feed them? And if I'm the disciples, I'm going, hey guys, I totally think he's setting us up, right? Pretty sure he knows the answer, and I'm not quite sure how to respond, right? And so it says he asked them this to test them. He already knew what he was going to do. And Philip answered him, well, I mean, it would take more than a half a year's wages. It's going to be we don't have that kind of money to buy enough bread for each one to even have a bite. I love it. He doesn't say we don't have enough bread for everyone to eat. He says there's no way that we could even conjure up enough for even everyone to have a little bite. That's how much we don't have. Another disciple, Andrew, Simon's brother, backs him up. He says, whoa, we've got 5 loaves of bread, 2 small fish, but how far are they really going to go? Like, it's not enough. And Jesus says, have the people sit down. And then there was plenty of grass in that place. They sat down. About 5,000 men were there. And so we can assume that probably more like 10 or 15,000 people with women and children counted in the mix. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them, filled 12 baskets with the pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. And so Jesus shows off. Not only does Jesus take the bread and the fish and multiply it exponentially so that everyone eats, he actually has leftovers, and he's like, hey guys, can you go gather the leftovers? That's how awesome I am, right? I just want to kind of punctuate this with an exclamation point. The beginning of the conversation was there's absolutely no way that we could ever conjure up enough for even everyone to have one small bite. Oh, can you go get the leftovers? Everyone's full now, and there's plenty left over. This is the story arc of the story. In Matthew chapter 16, it tells the story slightly different from a slightly different perspective, and I want to see the differences just because I think it illuminates the story for us even that much more. Matthew chapter 14, it says, the disciples came and said to him, hey, it's already getting late. This was their idea. We need to send the crowds away. We need to send them away to go get something to eat. And Jesus says, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Again, a side conversation going, guys, we had a good plan. Let's send them away. And then Jesus turned it around on us. You give them something to eat. What do we do with this, right? And they're like, oh, I hate it when he does that. Why can't he just go with the plan, right? You give them something to eat. And then in Matthew chapter 14, it says, well, we've only got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And Jesus says, bring them here to me. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples. The disciples gave them to the people. And I love that line. I love that line. That Jesus says, give me the bread and the fish. And Jesus does what Jesus does with them. And then he puts it back into the hands of the disciples. I love that picture. Because Jesus very easily could have said, just give me the bread and the fish, I'll do it. And I don't know about you, but I often find that my leadership style often is, it's just easier if I do it myself. It's going to be faster and better, right? And can you just for a second wrap your mind around the level of trust that Jesus has placed in our hands? Knowing full well that we're going to stumble and we're going to drop the ball. Like, can you imagine the amount of times that he rightfully could be sitting up in heaven going, oh my gosh, like it would just be so much easier if I do it myself. And yet that's not his MO. That's not how he does it. He takes the bread and the fish, he does what he does, and then he puts it back in the hands of his guys and says, I trust you, go. This is on you, go do it, okay? They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. So here's the simple point of the story. And here's between John and Matthew and other accounts, the story is essentially this. The disciples recognize that there's an overwhelming need in front of them. They're confronted with the fact that there is a need in front of them that they don't have the capacity in and of themselves to meet. And they turn to Jesus with the solution and say, we can't do this. We should send them away so someone else can take care of them. And Jesus says, actually, I want you to do it. And this becomes the peak of tension in their stories because they are now confronted by the fact that Jesus is asking them to do something that they cannot do. They don't have what it takes to do what Jesus is asking them to do. And they turn to Jesus and say, we've only got a few loaves of bread and a few fish that we stole or bought or tricked this little boy into giving us. We're not quite sure how they got it. They bring it back to Jesus and they're like, man, we understand what you're asking us to do, but we don't have what it takes to do what you're asking us to do. And Jesus' response in this moment is so unbelievably important to us. Because his response is not, guys, you know what? You're right. I'm sorry. I never meant to put you in that position. I never want you to feel uncomfortable. I never want you to feel inadequate. I never want you to ever feel like for a moment that you're not special and you've got everything that it takes and you've got it, right? I never want you to feel like you're not the total package. And so I'll never put you in that position again. I'm sorry, guys. You're right. I've got an idea. Why don't we send them away to get something to eat? And they're like, dude, that was our idea, right? Why are you always stealing our ideas? That's not his response. Actually, I think probably what's not recorded, and maybe I'll get to heaven and Jesus is like, that's not how it played out at all. But I like to think that it probably plays out this way. That the disciples are intentionally, purposefully put in a position by Jesus where they are forced to be confronted by the fact that they don't have what it takes to do what he's asking them to do. And they're uncomfortable in that tension. Jesus is perfectly okay with them being there. Because his response to them is now, hey guys, give me what you've got, even if you've assessed it and it feels like it's not enough, and watch what I can do with it. And so there is this significant and dramatic shift in expectation that Jesus has on us that we have got to come to grips with. Because here's the reality of this fear of not having what it takes. It is an unwelcome companion that walks with us throughout our entire journey. We have been involved in the foster care space for 10 years now. And that fear of I don't have what it takes, which ultimately kind of prevented me from saying yes in the beginning, is not the kind of thing that where once I get over it, it's gone and I never have to deal with it again. You better believe over the last 10 years, I have daily been confronted by the fact that I'm afraid I don't have what it takes. I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to keep on this journey, to do what you're asking me to do. So this fear of not having what it takes isn't something that once we deal with it, it's dealt with and it's done and gone forever. You probably know just as well as I do that this is a constant conversation that we are having with ourselves, and at times it is an unwelcome companion in our lives. I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to continue to raise my kids or to navigate this difficult season or to redeem some broken places in my marriage or to step out in faith to do what God's asking me and calling me to do. I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to deal with some of my past baggage or grief or guilt or things or trauma that I just haven't dealt with. I'm afraid I don't have what it takes to fill in the blank. And if we don't have the ability to relate to that fear well throughout our journey, it will ultimately crush us. And I think what Jesus does here is he completely reframes the way that we relate to that fear, and he brings a whole new substance to it that changes the dynamic of how we interact with that fear of not having what it takes forever. Jesus' expectation in this moment is not, guys, I want you to figure out how to have what it takes. Jesus' expectation in this moment is, I want you to be confronted by the fact that you don't have what it takes, and then I want you to give me what little you've got and watch what I can do. That's it. And so we had two goals this morning, that I don't fall in. So far, we're good. And the second simple goal is this, is that we understand this principle that Jesus lays out for us in this story, that not having what it takes doesn't disqualify us from being used by God. We're kind of taught to think that. Here's what God's asked me to do, but I don't have what it takes, and so I probably really can't be used by him, or I can't do that. Not having what it takes doesn't disqualify us from being used by God. In fact, it might be one of the very things which qualifies us the most. It's this complete reframing of our understanding that Jesus' expectations on us at these peak tension points in our story is not that we in and of ourselves have what it takes to overcome, but that we would be willing to give him what little we've got and to trust that he can multiply it exponentially. And so that story arc that sometimes feels up or down or left or right or crazy or backwards or forwards and we're not quite sure is filled with really beautiful opportunities for us to place into the hands of Jesus what little we've got and to watch what only he can do with it. This is why that crazy story arc that most of us live is beautiful, because it's punctuated by all of these opportunities for us to be reminded that in and of myself, I don't have what it takes. But the expectation that God has on me is not that I have what it takes, it's that I be willing to trust him with what little I have and watch what he can do with it. And then in the end, his power will be put on display more. Let me look at just another quick, familiar story to some of us. I won't even read it. I'll just tell you. It's the story of the poor widow. And the story is basically that Jesus is in the temple, and people are coming down and they're putting in their offerings. And some rich people are putting a lot of money into the offering plate. And then a poor widow comes and she throws in a couple of small copper coins. And the language there in the scriptures literally means that they were practically worthless, worth only a couple of cents, practically worthless. And so the juxtaposition here is rich people are putting in a lot of money. A poor widow comes and puts in a couple of coins that are practically worthless. And Jesus says, guys, you got to stop. You got to come over here. Stop what you're doing. Come over here. You've got to see what's happening because it's going to blow your mind. And he redefines a word for us in this story that, again, is one of those words that if we're not able to redefine, it's going to destroy us. It's going to paralyze us. It's going to crush us. He essentially says that the rich people put in a lot of money, and then this poor widow came and she put in more. She put in more than they put in because she put in all that she had. And it's that word more that Jesus redefines for us. And if you're thinking in quantitative terms, if you're the disciples, you're going, dude, stick to carpentry. You're not a very good accountant. The rich people put in a lot more money, right? You're totally wrong. But Jesus isn't speaking in quantitative terms. He's not saying, I've counted it all up, and her 2 coins are quantitatively worth more than what the rich people put in. No. So he's speaking in a different set of terms. And he redefines this word more for us, where in our world, more is defined in quantitative terms. More money, more house, more vacation, more likes, more followers, more this, more that, more status, more power, more position, more title, more. And Jesus completely flips it upside down and says, in the economy of God, more is not defined quantitatively. It's defined qualitatively, in the quality of our hearts and the quality of our sacrifice. And so we come to God and say, God, I don't think I've got what it takes to do what you're asking me to do. And he says, that's okay. Just give me what you've got and watch what I can do with it. And we say, but God, it really only feels like I've got a couple of small worthless coins to offer into this. And he says, perfect. That is worth far more than you could ever quantitatively measure on this side of eternity. God, I've just got a little bit of energy, a little bit of faith, a little bit of knowledge, if any at all, a little bit of hope, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And he says, great, I can work with that. And I think he calls his disciples over in heaven perhaps and says, guys, you got to see what's going on here. You see this lady here? She practically knows nothing about what it is that I'm asking her to do. But what little she's got, she's put it into the offering plate. And she's trusting that I can take it and multiply it exponentially. And it is far more valuable than you could ever possibly measure. So, a few questions for us. I wonder for you and for I, if we were to take an honest assessment of ourselves and how we navigate these peaks of tension in our own stories. And maybe you're in one now. And the set of questions that you could ask yourself would be like this. What opportunity has God put in front of you? What is God inviting you into? As you consider your own story and your own story arc and where you are right now in that as a family, as a couple, as an individual, what is it that God has in front of you that you're afraid of? You look at that and say, I don't have what it takes to do what you're asking me to do. What root fears do you need to address? If you were to do an honest assessment and say, here's the things I think I'm afraid of, but perhaps they're actually pointing back to some deeper root things where I need to do some work, where I need to allow the gospel to really speak truth into those places, because that's where the real work needs to be done. How does the truth of Scripture change your perception of not having what it takes? You feel like you're in a moment now or a season now where God has said, I'm bringing you into a place where you will be confronted by the fact that you don't have what it takes. And now you're in that place and you're going, man, I don't like it here. This is uncomfortable. I feel like, I don't really know what's going on. And you're like, Jesus, where are you in all of this? And Jesus is standing over there going, oh, I'm right here. This is great. This is really great. Okay? Just trust the process. I think sometimes that we're brought to that point where we feel kind of uncomfortable and we're being confronted by these things that we don't like being confronted by. And we're like, God, where are you? Where are you in all of this? And God's like, oh, I'm right here. I'm the one that brought you here. It's all good. And it's going to be really, really good. Just trust the process. What's the most simple and practical next step that you can take moving forward? What is it? It doesn't always have to be big. Maybe it's, I want to have coffee with this person because this person that I know has also confronted this same kind of tension peak in their story. And they're a few years ahead of me. And I want to sit down with them and I want to learn from them how they processed it and how they overcame it and how they navigated through it. Or maybe it's I need to go get professional help. I want to sit down with someone that they sit in a chair and I lie on the couch and they've got a lot of letters behind their name. They're super smart and I can just dump everything and their smartness can help me process it. Yeah, that's great. We all probably need to do that, right? What's the most practical, simple next step that you can take? So you may not be at that peak of tension now, but you have been at some point. And you will be again at another point. This is an unwelcome companion for us that will journey with us throughout our entire life. And what we see in John chapter 6 and Matthew chapter 14 is that God has given us this really beautiful opportunity to be able to relate to that tension well, to navigate through those fears well, and to see some really beautiful things happen when we would be willing to say, God, it's hard being here. It's uncomfortable being here. I'm being confronted by things that I'd rather just not be confronted by. But the decision that I'm making in this moment is I'm going to give you what little I've got, and I'm going to trust that you have the ability to multiply it exponentially more than I could ever possibly fathom on this side of eternity. And so that's the best that I can do. And I think his response to us in those moments is, perfect. That's all I ask of you. That's all I ask of you. Just give me what little you've got and watch what I can do with it. So let me pray for us. Father, I don't know where we all are. I don't even sometimes know where I am in this journey. But I do know that all of us at some point have been and will be confronted by these peaks of tension where we're really forced to deal with some things and to navigate through these nuances of fear and trust and do I have what it takes, and turning costs into investments and privileges and all of these things. And so it's complicated and it can be difficult and it can be nuanced. And so I just pray for us this morning that your Spirit would give us simple clarity and would give us a resolve and a confidence in knowing that we don't have to have it all figured out. Whatever the next step is for us, we don't have to have step 10 figured out. But what you're inviting us into is just take the next simple step and trust me. And trust me. Father, I do know that that's going to lead some of us in this room into some very hard places that we would just prefer to avoid. It's going to take us back to some places that we've buried long ago. It's going to invite us into some new spaces that we never thought we would ever participate in. So collectively, we understand the implications of what it is that we are inviting you to be a part of in our hearts. We understand that. We get it. But I ask, Father, that you would do that work in us, that you would get to the root of where we are, and that you would bring about a level of freedom for us. A freedom that says, I don't always have to have what it takes. I don't always have to have it figured out. The only expectation that you have on me is that I would be willing to give you what little I've got and to trust you with the rest. So, Father, bring about a freedom in us as we rest in that truth. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.